Welcome to the video lecture series, Culture, Worldview, and Origins. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. In this series, we're looking at the non-Western biblical origin of life. And this is lecture number 1. You might ask, why do you put non-Western biblical? Well, because the biblical record, or the revelation, whether it be special revelation, which is through the biblical record communicated directly from God to man, or through general revelation, it all needs to be interpreted. It all needs to be understood. And that's what the area of hermeneutics is the science of interpretation. And what are the rules, and how do we interpret by? So we do not get let's say information directly into us just as it is. That information comes to us, and then we interpret it through a grid that we formed. And that is what the series is about, is on a quote by Stephen Jay Gould about how science functions, and not just science, but how we ourselves function in our thinking processes. Stephen Jay Gould had said, first, facts do not come to us as objective items seen in the same unambiguous way by all reasonable people. Theory, habit, prejudice, and culture all influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them. And that is Stephen Jay Gould's factoring in why scientists and why us as humans, as reasonable people, we all don't think alike. We don't all reason the same way, even though we are still reasonable. Why? Well, he lists 4 factors: theory, habit, prejudice, and culture all enter into to influence the interpretation process, or the perceiving process. And that is what the lenses on this side is, what they're trying to communicate, is that we have question marks, we have doubts, we don't understand something, and the world is full of things we don't understand. So we invite in an expert that has a study in that area, in that field, and that expert then studies, but that expert then, through his lenses, through his academic formation, but not only his academic formation, but the 4 factors that Stephen Jay Gould mentions. First is culture. His culture tints his tendencies of how he processes things and what. And then based on the culture, he then adopts a theory. A theory is a way of looking out, prejudices first. Goes from the culture to prejudices, prejudging, in that how do we prejudge, and that is through our tendencies. Before we can evaluate, before we can look at something and understand what we're looking at, we have to have a grid. We have to have a system put together of how to think and how to understand what we're looking at. So that is the prejudices. And then once we have the prejudices, then we go into the thinking and the looking at theories. And theory comes from theorem, which is in Greek it's the base for the word spectator, which is how we look at things. And so a theory is basically how we look at things. And then it becomes a habit. A habit is formed of putting all those factors together, and we come up with a conclusion. And that conclusion then is actually a package deal. It's a prescribed conclusion based on the culture, prejudices, theories, and habits of the person that is interpreting it. And so the interpretation that we give, or that we get also, is always somebody's perspective, from somebody's standpoint. And that's what we're coming to, is that the house that we have used from early on in the building process and the thinking process, and how thinking processes are put together. And we start with the culture on the bottom, and that is called the Weltbild in the German, which their concept. The Weltbild is all the bottom layer, which is the influences of culture. It's the influences of our families, of our belief system, of our environment and surroundings. Then that, based on that Weltbild, the 0 point, ground zero, then we choose a source of reliable knowledge. And there was 4 sources of reliable knowledge that we've gone over, whether it be the intuitive, or whether it be the authoritative, or whether it be the reason based, or the empirical. Those are 4 basic sources of reliable knowledge. What one do we choose? And then based on the reliable knowledge, then we start forming the basic beliefs. And basic beliefs are something that we don't defend. They're assumed based on our source of reliable knowledge. And so that is basic beliefs then form a prejudice in Stephen Jay Gould's term. It's our prejudice of how we view things. And that forms a system of thought, which is a philosophy, a philosophical system. Then we have our methods. How do we apply our methods? Well, our methods depend on what our source is. If our source is authoritative, and in other words, it's outside, then what we do is we submit to that outside source, we meditate on that outside source, and we receive. But if our source is reason, human reason based, then that's internal. Then we take the internal source and we go out with it, and we reason using an internal source of authority. Then our methods. So our methods are based on our source of knowledge. Then we have a system that's applied to practice, and a practice that would be our modeling. That would be our science. What science model do we implement is based on it's obviously the bottom layer, which is the Weltbild, and then the source of reliable knowledge, the basic beliefs, the methods, all form a model. They'll come together to form a model, and that's what we're talking about, is models. And that's what I had said in the beginning of this whole lecture series, is that I had no grid or understanding of how to discern between different models, and different models of science, or political models, or economical models. I didn't have the understanding of how to discern which model I should pertain to, but now I believe I do have a way to understand and to look at the different models and say, no, I don't agree with that model, and why and where. Well, it starts with my source of reliable knowledge, or my underpinning, my Weltbild, and then it goes to my basic beliefs. Does it violate my basic beliefs? Then my methods. What methods are employed, and do I agree with those methods? Do those methods agree with my source of reliable knowledge? And then the resources. What are the resources available to explain and understand that outside world? Is it just time, energy, and chance, or is it God and He created? And so those are the different resources, and so that is our building structure and how we can understand different models. And I think that this is really important, because we are coming into a time where information is easy to get to, and information is bombarding all different institutions, whether they be churches or seminaries or colleges, and we aren't equipping the students to discern, to be able to understand, can I accept this or not? And it's becoming, I believe, a little problematic and confusing, and so that then we just say, there's no answer, I give up. And but that's a danger, because that influences everything we do. So we need to understand, we need to be equipped, and that's what this series is about, is equipping. And it's not trying to put on somebody or force somebody to think the way I think, but what it is to think. And to reason, and to know what's going on, and which model that I should really adopt, and what can I adopt and still be faithful to my basic beliefs, my source of reliable knowledge, my basic beliefs and my methods. Okay, we talked about Western before, and we've talked about non-Western. In this series, we're looking at the non-Western perspective of the origin of life. You're like, well, what does that mean? Well, this is what we're going over and going to go over in every lecture is repeating what does a non-Western biblical parameter look like. Well, the non-Western cultural tendency, one, it starts with a very spiritual dimension. It has its spiritual and its physical worlds are one. And so it's not like the Western thinking that divides the natural and the supernatural, and those are clean divisions. It's not like that at all. Their world is full of spiritual influences. And in fact, in most of their world, the spiritual influence comes first and has effect over the material world. So their universal domain is creator and created. It's not natural and supernatural. There is a creator, and everything else was created in some way or another. So in the starting point is the world is not natural. The world was created, and the world is still inhabited by its creator and by the created subjects. How is the operating system? Number two, universal operating system. It has to be an open system. And what I mean by that, we're not talking about energy in or energy out. What we're talking about is influence, divine influence. Is it a closed system? Western science demands a closed system, no influence, no interference, so that the uniformity, okay, uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism is not really about speed of things. Uniformitarianism is about effects, the effect of thing, the effect, the cause, the cause and effect. The cause is always going to be uniform, natural causes, closed system. So it's closed in that it's always going to be, the cause is always going to be natural, and it's going to follow natural laws because it's a closed system. This here is an open system, which means the creator God of the universe inhabits, and the beings, the spiritual beings that he also created, are also within that system and influence the system. If you have an open system, then you cannot really extrapolate backwards nor forward very, very far, because the system can be not just interfered with, because they're inhabiting the system itself. So it's not interference. They believe that God is actually sustaining the system, and by his power. And so that an open system does not, you cannot predict. It's not predictable. So this here is governed by the creator or other created power source. They are believers. They are real believers in the spiritual realm. Number three, their external authority. Because they're open system, they believe in an external authority. That authority that is external to themselves. They look to a chief. They look to a whatever leader is out there, that is the authority, whether it be starts with the father or mother in the home, and then it goes to the spiritual leader in the community, and then it can go farther out. But what it is it's an external authority that they are really submit to. It doesn't come into their mind to make decisions independently and to run with those decisions. They always are submissive to, if it's a decision that's going to affect others, it has to be through the channels of correct authority. Sources of reference. They are usually very historically based. And what I mean by sources of reference is that our libraries, Western libraries, are based on fiction and nonfiction. And it depends on what section you want to go to. And what that means is that our libraries are based on fiction, because the other side is nonfiction. So fiction is the center point. Whereas in this culture, they are very concrete based, concrete visual learners, and they learn from history. And so really hard for them to understand a concept that they've never experienced, or that is impossible to do or improbable, that they don't learn from that. They can't learn from something they have not really experienced. So in other words, their reference points are historical. Okay, what would be the reliable source of knowledge? Well, again, those are the four sources that you have to choose from. And in the Western world, it's mostly, especially in academics, in churches and seminaries, and it's logical knowledge. That's what's taught, sequential logical knowledge. But with the non-Western, it's number two, the authoritarian knowledge. And under authoritarian knowledge comes revelation. Revelation it's revealed source of reliable knowledge. And to have revealed source of reliable knowledge, you have to have an open system. Now, in the Western world, even in the Christian Western world, there's many that doubt or that believe in the closed system and therefore doubt revelation. They don't believe scriptures are inspired because of the closed system. So they have a different perspective. But these people, this group, non-Western, looks at authoritarian knowledge. They submit to that as their authority. So in other words, it is revelation that comes from God through special revelation or through general revelation. That would be their reliable source. So now here we have the house, the beginning of the house. We have one is the bottom layer. You see all the symbols there. Those come from a symbol for a grounding circuit in house plans. So in other words, what is the house grounded on? It's ground zero, which is the Weltbild, which is the non-Western thinking pattern. Non-Western thinking pattern, then tendency, then produces the foundation. What do they choose as a reliable source of knowledge? One, it's biblical, it's revealed, it's external, and it's an open system. So those are the characteristics of this culture that we're looking at that produce the scriptures. And if we're to reproduce the interpretations correctly, then we need to assume the same parameters and look at it from those parameters of what they're looking at. Again, this is the house figure. Just knowing that those are all the variables within the house structure, within the thinking structure. From 0 to 14, those are all the variables that are involved. And so we can come up with a lot of different models of science depending on the different variables and what we choose to put in each one. But what we need to realize is it is a choice. And there's a lot of variables. And so when you're listening to somebody, and you're listening to me, you got to understand the variables that they have chosen to interpret by and what they're going by. So that's what this series is about, is exposing the variables, revealing the variables, and that what each model is coming from has different variables, have different values that they assign to those numbers. And what we need to do is to develop our own reasoning system, our own belief system, and then understand that we need to be consistent and we need to follow our belief system all the way up through the house and practice a model that corresponds to our belief system. Again, we're Tim and Holly Nyquist. If you'd like to communicate with us, you can find us at the doubleroadrover.com or at thn.academia@gmail.com. Again, this is lecture number 1 on the origin of life with the biblical non-Western parameters. Thanks for listening.